Ladies and gentlemen, so last month our CoveTalk series focused upon Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and how it can be considered to be exposing the constants and variables of the nature of warfare. This month we're going to continue to focus on this conflict and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but here we'll delve further into the Russian actions and operations in the information environment. Much has been expected of this vaunted capability. Indeed, Thomas Rid wrote of it in his book of Russian information operations, titled Active Measures, and James Roberts wrote of it as well in Maskarova 2.0. However, these information, including cyber capabilities, have still not provided Russia its decisive advantage that was expected. Arguably, it is the Ukraine that is achieving more in the information domain as it mobilises support from allies, partners, friends and like-minded groups. However, it's important to remind ourselves that there are multiple perspectives on this conflict and its meaning. So my name is Major Jeremy Barraclough from Headquarters 2nd Division, and the topic for this last Tuesday of the month, Professional Military Education, is In Defiance of Expectations, where we'll explore the Russian invasion and its influence abroad. Our presenter today is Professor Matthew Sussex, or Matt, from ANU, and thank you for being so generous with your time here today. This is one of our CoveTalk series in association with the Cove and the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess and Headquarters 2nd Division. Just a quick note before we start, this presentation is deliberately delivered at the unclassified level. The views presented here today do not represent those of the Australian Government, Department of Defence or the Australian Army. These views presented today are those of the speakers themselves. Without any further ado, I'll pass over the floor to Matt. Thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you so very much, Jeremy. And thank you, folks, for coming out to see this presentation. I must say that I've been quite keen to come out and do a CoveTalk for quite a while, and really glad that I've got the opportunity. As Jeremy said, I'm going to be talking about Russia's information war, but particularly in terms of its influence operations in Australia. That's kind of the second part of the talk. The first part of the talk, I'll give you a bit of just an update on how the war is going, what it looks like, what the future trajectory might resemble, and then I'll try and segue, I was going to say seamlessly, but frankly probably about as seamlessly as a burning T-80 tank, to our region and Australia. So do bear with me. If I look off to my left, your right, it's not a nervous tick. I'm simply trying to look at my slides to remind myself what I had on them. And that's because Russia specialists in Australia are fairly thin on the ground. Most of them have retired or died. And as a result, we very rarely get called upon to talk about our main areas of expertise. And when we do, we tend to not be able to shut up. So the script is just as much for me as it is for you to keep myself on message. But do feel free, folks, to generate questions. And I'm looking forward to very much to engaging with you once I'm done with the actual presentation. So, where are we at so far in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which happened on February 24th, 2022? Well, we are at day 579 of Vladimir Putin's three-day war. He thought it was going to be over or virtually over within about a week. This is what his intelligent head, Narishkin, was telling him in a classic example of telling the Tsar what he wanted to hear. Russian intelligence said effectively that Putin's depiction of Ukrainians as being ruled by thuggish neo-Nazis, and that effectively the Ukrainian population was sympathetic to Russia, that they would be greeted if they invaded with flowers. Turned out to be completely wrong. Of course, they were greeted by the Ukrainian armed forces, which had spent years. Of course, this is a war that has been going on 8 years since the capture of Crimea by the Russians in 2014. Basically confronted with all of their military might and by the citizens with things like Molotov cocktails. So Putin made a number of miscalculations in this war. Miscalculation number one was the quality of Russia's armed forces, which were touted and, frankly, believed by the West to be the second best in the world. This was after the military modernization campaign that Putin ordered in 2010 that followed the abortive, or very, very fast, 5-day war against Georgia, where Russia effectively destroyed the Georgian military machine. This was deemed by Putin not to be good enough, and so he embarked on a spending spree of about $600 billion to modernize the Russian armed forces. The assumption was that the Russians were better trained, better equipped, and more able to carry on the fight than the Ukrainians, and that would be over fairly swiftly. That's not just what Putin thought. That's what we thought as well. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, was being told when he asked for weapons and support just before the conflict started, because of course he's being told that it was about to happen, he was being told by the West, don't worry about it, why should we help you, you won't be here in a week. Right? Now of course he is. Miscalculation number 2 was the strength of Ukrainian resistance. The Ukrainian armed forces are, well, many case studies will be written about the way they have gone about attriting the Russian forces. Mick Ryan refers to this as corrosion, a strategy of corrosion, whereby you effectively hit the enemy in the rear as much as possible using small mobile groups, cut off their supply, you gradually corrode them to death, and this has been highly effective. Less effective, of course, when it comes to counteroffensives, but we can talk about that later on. And of course, I think the third miscalculation is the Western response. It was anticipated by the Russians that the West would probably jump up and down and shout a bit, but not really do anything significant to intervene in the conflict. And certainly the messaging he was receiving from Western leaders, including President Joe Biden, on the eve of the conflict, when they had meetings and summits, and Biden said in no uncertain terms that NATO would not get involved militarily in the event of a conflict involving Russia and Ukraine on Ukrainian soil. That was something that Putin interpreted more or less as a green light. And I think that tells us something actually about the way we try and deter adversaries, that a sort of preference for risk aversion and conflict de-escalation at every turn is something that can have counterproductive outcomes. So in this case, I think as well. But the West itself has been, I think, surprised by the extent to which, and when I say West, I mean the sort of general broader West, I'm particularly talking about the transatlantic nations, but I'd also include Australia as well, as a country that really has stepped up in terms of its willingness to help the Ukrainians. I think they've been surprised at the extent to which they have responded, and in many respects I think it has been something that's been quite important for Western unity at a time when most of the writing about the West was that it was fraying, democratic deficits decaying, and so forth. We've seen also recently the first real direct challenge to Vladimir Putin's rule. Putin has created a system around himself whereby the competing Kremlin clans, and depending on who you talk to, there are 16 or 32, or possibly even more than that, the competing Kremlin clans are kept at each other's throats, whereas the real centre of power is Vladimir Putin. That suits him, of course, because it means it's difficult for rivals to cohere and present themselves as viable challengers. But it's also a problem for Russia, because there is no answer in terms of the leadership of the Russian state currently other than Vladimir Putin. What we saw with the bizarre Wagner March for Justice, led by the recently deceased Yevgeny Prigozhin, who remained unmurdered for far longer than we anticipated he would, was a genuine challenge to the power of the Kremlin. The fact that Putin's own National Guard did not attempt to stop the Wagner convoy, the fact that the Russian armed forces did not attempt to stop the Wagner convoy, the fact that ordinary civilians and citizens did not lie down in front of a Wagner tank to protect Vladimir Putin, are all things that point, I think, to the first signs of regime fragility in the Russian Federation. And this is something I think that we do need to watch very closely. The response, of course, has been to selectively purge not just Wagner itself, but also the armed forces where Wagner had many sympathisers. And the sympathisers tended to be at the sort of captain, major, colonel rank. Those which had, of course, a lot of operational experience on the battlefield, as well as the ability to reach out to other ranks in order to do messaging. So this is potentially quite dangerous for the leader of a effectively totalitarian state like Russia. When you have the middle ranks of an officer corps starting to get swayed by potential alternatives, you need to step on it very quickly. And he's done that by basically putting General Surovikin, the architect of the Surovikin line, under virtually house arrest and now pretty much exile, sacking him from his job as chief of the Russian Air Force, and also selectively removing a lot of the most capable commanders in Ukraine for effectively questioning and re-education. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, much is spoken about it. Much is complained about in terms of the Ukrainian counteroffensive as well. Why is it going so slowly? Why is it that they haven't driven the Russians entirely out of their country? Well, give them a break. They've had about 8 weeks, and the Russians had 6 months, if not longer, to prepare heavily entrenched defensive fortifications, minefields, tank traps, dragon's teeth, trenches, and so on, which make it very, very difficult to conduct offensive operations against, especially, of course, when you don't have air power, and that's something that the Ukrainians lack. Even so, they are continuing to show incremental gains. They have about 10 kilometres away from where they need to be, which is the town of Tokmak in Ukraine's south. Once they capture that, if they capture that, they will be able to capture one of the main Russian supply rail lines and one of the main roads. The only other road goes along the coast, and from Tokmak, that's in range of Ukrainian fires. So that is something that I think the Ukrainian armed forces are looking to try and do as soon as possible. It just depends whether winter wins or not. Certainly the Russians are planning for a war of 3 to 4 years minimum. The Ukrainians would rather it is over before that. Let's talk about Putin's progress a little bit more. It's about 1/5 of Ukraine's territory that Ukraine controls, including Crimea, of course, as well as the restive eastern regions in the Donbass. And I think it's probably fair to say that Russia probably has reached its high water mark without recourse to something truly unusual or weapons that Vladimir Putin has threatened to use, but not done so far. Effectively, the Russian armed forces are not capable of conducting offensive operations, given they're relying so much on mobilized soldiers. Estimated 320 to 350,000 Russian soldiers currently in Ukraine, of which a fair few, about 50%, are mobilized. Russia has undergone 2 episodes of quiet mobilization in order to generate new cannon fodder for the Ukrainian front. First time, about 150,000. Second time, about another 150,000, but ongoing in the background, quiet mobilization as well, where bosses of factories, bosses of businesses are told, you must provide 25 conscripts, right? Where people walking down the street of military age are summoned and presented with draft papers. This has not happened by and large in the main areas where you have influence and power in Russia. Of course, those 2 places are Moscow and St. Petersburg. Tends to be something that's been confined to Russia's regions. And of course, Russia's ethnic minorities are those which have been disproportionately figured in the Russian armed forces over time anyway, but also in terms of these mobilizations. Tuvans, Kalmyks, Chechens, Dagestanis, and so forth. The Russian parliament, as a good indication of its losses, has raised the maximum military service age from 40 to 65, which is extraordinary. There are people, reports of people who are in fact blind being called up and pressed into service. And when they protest, "I am blind," they say it doesn't matter, you're being mobilised anyway. Right. Some are treated well once mobilised, others are treated exceptionally poorly. The quality of the kit they're given is very variable. Sometimes they have to rely on their families and friends to pay for uniforms for them, to pay for body armour, to pay for helmets. Yeah, the situation is really very patchy. It does not scream world's second best military. It kind of screams world's 32nd best military, if that. We know also, of course, that Russia has had large numbers of war stocks. One of the things it's been good at, of course, is selling arms to others and producing large amounts of armaments for itself. But it has been churning through precision-guided munitions at a significant rate. This is why it's relying much, much more heavily on Iranian Shahid drones when it comes to hitting population centres, civilian infrastructure, and sometimes the odd military target in Ukraine. And in addition to that, it's fired an enormous amount of artillery at the Ukrainians, artillery rounds. I was speaking to Jack Watling at Russi. Some of you may know the name. He is a savant when it comes to the Russian military. He was out here for a couple of weeks. He estimates that the Russians shot about 12 to 12.5 million artillery rounds at the Ukrainians last year. This year they're being slightly more circumspect because they've been running out, but they're still going to fire 7.5 million. Their domestic production capacity prior to the war was 1.5 million per annum. They've recently opened a new factory helped by the Iranians, 120mm. It's producing. That will boost that up to 2.5 million rounds per year, but certainly not able to make up the shortfall. Right? And that's why they're turning to everyone's favourite small dictator Kim Jong-un to do it for him because they can produce large amounts of 125mm ammunition, fits Soviet kit. Well, in fact, North Korean kit is Soviet kit. And Soviet/Russian kit. So that's the big hope for Russia, is to enable it to keep in the fight, the artillery fight that is, through partnership with the North Koreans, the Iranians, potentially even others, South Africa, those who are prepared to, let's say, take a bet each way on the rules-based order. And estimated tank losses at about 3,000. So now you're seeing T-51s, T-48s, even coming out of storage, museum pieces effectively being used in Ukraine. It's estimated that Russia's committed 80% of its ground forces, which is an extraordinary number. And we just don't know really how many they've lost, but some of the tend to be more accurate losses that count the number of payments made by Russian social service to families. They're the most accurate, and that's about 250,000 at the moment. It's a lot of dead people. In the process, wiping out also a huge proportion of its special forces, its Spetsnaz and VDV, airborne troops, which will take a generation to replace. Sanctions. In many respects, no, sanctions aren't having the broad-based effect of bringing Russia to its knees, but they are having numerous effects elsewhere. Russia's inability to get itself semiconductors until the Chinese stepped in, saw it, and chips as well, saw it scouring the world for semiconductors. There's a reason that there is a global second-hand PlayStation and Xbox shortage, as Russia has been buying them all up. There are sanctions on, of course, the Russian airline industry, domestic airlines, are unable to be serviced by Boeing and Airbus. Now they've converted most of their domestic fleet from Tupolevs and Ilyushins to Boeings and Airbuses, which is why we see a lot more crashes in Russia and a lot more bad landings. Recently, an Airbus landed in a field in Russia, and it's estimated that travel in Russia by air at the moment, because they are cannibalizing their domestic fleet, has resulted in far fewer flights, so people can't go where they want to go, and travel is about twice as dangerous as it was prior to the war. But of course, we also know that Ukraine is taking very heavy losses itself. If you typically look at a sort of power map and you say, compare Russia and Ukraine, you would say, oh, well, the Russians win easily. But of course, as we know, when it comes to military arts, it's all about the quality, not necessarily the quantity. And I think this is where the Ukrainians really have demonstrated that superior doctrine, that maneuverability, mobility, the ability to adapt, the ability to have people of lower ranks make decisions swiftly, as opposed to the old sclerotic Russian chain of command, where everything has to go up, 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 until which time targets of opportunity have completely disappeared. I think the Ukrainian system has shown that adaptability is really quite useful. Someone was telling me recently that the Ukrainians have got the ability now to get from arriving at a site with a howitzer to having it set up and ready to fire, down to about 3 minutes, which is quite extraordinary, because the American standard was something like 10 to 12, because everybody's got different jobs. There's the dude that drives the truck, there's the dude that unhooks it. So I think multi-skilling is something that we can also learn out of this conflict. Now, how did it come about? Let me take a step back briefly and give you two narratives. Here's the Russian narrative. This is important because I'll be talking about it later and there'll be a quiz. One is that it was NATO, the US, and the West that was at fault. Putin, in 2019, when he unveiled a suite of so-called wonder weapons, this included the Avangard hypersonic missile system, basically a FOB system, the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile, and the Poseidon nuclear-armed drone submarine. He unveiled all these wonder weapons in 2019, and he intoned very solemnly, in the past nobody listened to us, well, listen to us now. Look what we can develop. There is a sense in which, excuse me, there is a sense in which blaming NATO and the United States for Russia's ills is certainly very convenient for Vladimir Putin. Is there a grain of truth to it? Well, the Russian argument has been around for some time. It predates Putin, in fact. It goes back to about 1996, where former Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov was saying that, effectively, if you have the expansion of NATO that doesn't include Russia, with not just a voice, but also the thing everybody else in NATO has, which is a veto, right? If you deny Russia the veto, which was the deal on the table from the West, then realistically you're still a collective defence organisation aimed at us. There's some truth to that. However, it's something that, as I think over time, turned into a catechism for the Russian Federation, particularly under Putin. You see it consistently, the idea that the West wants to support so-called colour revolutions, whether they're in Ukraine, whether they're in Georgia. And for Putin, of course, if you have revolution in Kiev, today Kiev, tomorrow Moscow, something he fears. The whole notion of a Gerasimov doctrine was built up out of an assessment of what the West, or the Russians think the West, is trying to do to Russia. The Russian argument is that this created an existential threat through NATO expansion and the potential for Ukraine joining, conveniently ignoring, of course, that NATO expansion to Ukraine was not even on the table in 2022. First of all, the Germans, and second, the Americans would have scotched it. So that's narrative one. Narrative two, of course, is that what we've seen recently is the growing radicalization of the Russian leadership that has become fundamentally anti-NATO, fundamentally anti-Western, as a kind of strategic reflex that if it happens in the West, then it's bad. Right? The West is the architect of woke, transgender, decrepit ideologies that threaten Russian conservative Christian values, something that's been promoted very heavily, of course, in Russia. And the recreation of far-right nationalist totems, right? Rebirthing of past heroes. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, almost always from the Tsarist era, but sometimes Joseph Stalin as someone who stood up to the West, right? Someone who kept Russia strong. These are things that you find almost now ubiquitous in Russian society. There are celebrations of militarism constantly. There is a day where children as young as 5 come to school dressed in military uniform, dressed up with tanks around them that their parents have created. Competitions, in fact, amongst parents to do this. It is a heavily, heavily militarised society, venerates militarism. And not just the military as a symbol of honour, but fighting and bloodletting as a symbol of honour, that it doesn't matter what you do on the battlefield, because you are doing it for Mother Russia, you are absolved of anything that you might do when you're there that might otherwise be seen as horrible. Effectively, what we are seeing the Russians doing is seeking to recreate the geopolitical footprint of the Russian Empire. And you may not believe me on that, and I'll tell you why you're wrong very shortly. Which is accurate. To an extent, like all stories, both are accurate, right? But above all, I think either of those narratives, both of those narratives point to not strength, but they point to weakness. If it is in fact that NATO is somehow to blame, right? That is the evil machinations of the US hegemon, then that speaks to a Russia that is fundamentally afraid. It speaks to a Russia that is worried about its future being caught in a geopolitical pincer between the US and Europe on one side and China on the other, and being reduced to little more than an open-cut mine and a petrol station. If it's the other one that's correct, then that's reflective of weakness as well. The perception that we are vulnerable to colour revolutions and so forth says that the regime is fragile. Just on the Nazis, Ukrainians are Nazis theme, debunking that myth is very, very easy. This is a list of Russian articles about Ukraine that mention Nazism. Nothing, 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 nothing. War starts, all of a sudden they're Nazis. One of the best visualizations I've seen to debunk that bit of propaganda. Russian messaging in the war. If you have the misfortune, like I do, to watch Russian state TV and its terrible talk shows, then you can pluck some of this stuff out. The name Ukraine must be erased. The re-education of its population will take a generation, from RIA Novosti. A considerable portion of Ukrainians are infected with the madness of Nazism. We must cleanse them of the dirt. That is the lady in the background of that picture, Margarita Simonyan, who is the chief gargoyle of Russia today, one of the chief propagandists. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. Zelensky is Jewish, and Hitler also had Jewish blood. Now, I mentioned before that, you can challenge me on whether Russia is seeking to recreate the empire of the past. Don't believe me, believe Vladimir Putin. June 10 last year, Peter the Great returned what is Russia's. It is now our turn to take our lands back. He's told us, basically, why he's fighting this war. And more recently, Vladimir Solovyov, another propagandist in Russia. I firmly believe there will be nuclear war. There'll be no more London, no more Berlin, no more Paris. In that case, he'd better get his wife and kids out of Paris, because that's where they live, like a lot of the Russian elite. How does Russia sell its conflict? It sells it using a variety of different active measures, which are used not just to prop up its propaganda and its messaging, but also to do a variety of other functions, some of them clandestine, some of them overt, some of them involving, of course, killing as well. Shameless plug for something I wrote for the Journal of Cyber Policy with some of my colleagues a couple of years ago. That Russia seeks to weaken democratic states' institutions, its infrastructure, its industry, its individuals and or its ideas. In other words, the 5 I's of democracies. See what I did there? Russian approach to active measures in information warfare has moved beyond very simple depictions of Russia being involved in a total war, a war that involves military conflict, economic conflict, and war in the information domain. It's become much more sophisticated. According to Igor Penarin, one of its chief strategists, using things like extortion, like lies, like blackmail, all of these are instruments of power, right? Instruments which can be used to manipulate others. This makes information warfare as significant, in his view at least, as kinetic power. A lot of what Russia does is to try and change the way its adversaries make decisions, and in doing so maintain escalation dominance and strategic surprise when it comes to doing things. And of course, in the United States and in Europe, there are many who did not think Russia would invade. Right? The dominant view was probably, no, it won't happen. So to some degree, this has been effective. The way Russia approaches information warfare, hand in glove with kinetic power, is to try and be as adaptive as possible, to do things in an isolated way, to do things that might help Russia's capabilities, excuse me, through things like sabotage, the blowing up of Czech arms factories in 2015, with weapons that were destined for Ukraine. Hybrid campaigns also to seize territory, Crimea. So the idea is that it's scalable. You can dial it up, you can dial it down. It doesn't always work in practice, of course. The enablers of this approach are, of course, PMCs, the Wagner Group until recently, but funnily enough, Putin has not learnt the lesson that PMCs can in fact be potentially dangerous. The lesson he's learnt is we need more of them. Right? Russia has embarked on a spree of creating new PMCs over the last year or so, about another 35 at least that we know of. It uses its cyber espionage assets, it uses hybrid warfare, covert ops, cyber, that when it comes to deal with dissenters, whether it's people like Alexei Navalny, who is currently, of course, in jail in Siberia and will die there, poisoning him with exotic 4th-generation chemical weapons, and other dissidents, of course, in London, the Skripals. It's effectively the Russian government saying, we will kill you in the most exotic way possible, and everybody will know it was us, and you will be able to do nothing about it. Influence operations and info warfare, including compromat. Some of my colleagues, because I like being called Matt, some of my colleagues call me compromat for some weird reason, I don't know why. Social engineering, misinformation and disinformation. And it uses these assets, a variety of them. Interestingly, in the Russian intel system, particularly when it comes to doing aggressive, hostile acts against other nations, offensive cyber, of course, being part of it, there is no coordination between agencies. In fact, agencies are encouraged to compete with one another. We know this because we do know that both the GRU, military intelligence, and the FSB, supposedly domestic intelligence, but it does it internationally too, were both inside the Democratic National Committee service at the same time and didn't know. A variety of different hacks that they've been responsible for, of course. One of the main threat actors in this space is Fancy Bear, which has hacked the German and the Norwegian parliaments, the White House, NATO, the OSCE, the Democratic National Committee emails. Cozy Bear, which is attached to the FSB, which has stolen COVID vaccine research, also attacked DNC servers. A variety of different think tanks in the UK and in the United States, and responsible also for the SolarWinds hack. And sometimes, of course, the Russian government uses those people who aren't directly associated with the Russian state, like this chap, Maxim Yakubets. He runs a company that is called, you cannot make this up, Evil Corp. Evil Corp, and it's one of the corporations that superseded that, ransomware, spyware, hacking group. R-Evil was responsible for the Medibank hack in Australia. All of these things, if you come up against them online during your endless searching of the interwebs, I suggest you stay away from. Particularly geopolitica.ru, but you probably would anyway, let's face it. But things like Newsfront and Global Research, Strategic Culture Foundation, these are all notional online think tanks. They publish analysis, blogs, research. Right? They get quite heavily promoted through Google algorithms. So when you search for things, there are hits that you can click on, and it's all propaganda. It's being run and bankrolled by a man called Konstantin Malafiev, who is a billionaire in Russia, one of Putin's mates. He is an actual imperialist. He wants Putin to declare himself Tsar. He's the one that bankrolls Alexander Dugin, the far right-wing Russian ideologue whose daughter was blown up last year in a car bombing. But they're also behind things like Ruski Mir, Ruski Mir's Russian World. Now, various countries have different organisations that serve to promote culture and language and so forth. The French have the Alliance Francaise, the Chinese have Confucius Institutes. Ruski Mir does sort of film nights, music, culture, but also a very, very heavy dose of Putin-esque ideology. And they have extensive ties with the Nochny Volki, the Night Wolves, a motorcycle gang that has chapters in pretty much every European country and is active here in Australia as well. When utilising misinformation and disinformation, it's often said that Russia uses the fire hose of falsehood. This is a term from the RAND Corporation that's entered into very common usage. I personally disagree that it is a fire hose of falsehood, but it is alliterative. So I come up with my own, which is a sawn-off shotgun of shit, as opposed to a fire hose of falsehood. A fire hose of falsehood suggests you can turn it on and aim it at particular targets. Russian misinformation and disinformation is not like that. It is blasting pellets everywhere throughout an information ecosystem. With the idea being you reach up and you grab one of those pellets, right? Something that might interest you. It might be anti-vaccine research. It might be you're worried about globalism. You don't like capitalism. You're worried about losing your job because you work in the service industry, right? That can then connect you with other bits that it sprays into that ecosystem, right? And you become part of it. Russian misinformation and disinformation campaigns after Ukraine, I quite like this little map as to where you find it. You find a lot in South Africa. You find a lot in South Asia. The only thing that's not on that map that should be is Southeast Asia. There is an enormous amount of effort going into Indonesia and Malaysia in particular. Right? Countries where, for various reasons, messages such as NATO is to blame for the war, the West is responsible, fall on fairly receptive ears. And of course it happens in Australia too. Last year we had the March for Australian Neutrality around the country, in fact, in all major cities. The biggest one in Sydney, with a banner that shows a Russian soldier. This, he fights for freedom, and of course a digger, he fights for freedom. This man is your friend, this man is your friend. Do we know, or at least I'll tell you why this is Russian propaganda. And the reason why it is Russian propaganda is the little ribbon on the left. Right? That is a deliberate troll to Western watchers of Russia. It's the St. George ribbon. The St. George ribbon, you can see Putin and the chronically alcoholic Dmitry Medvedev both wearing the St. George ribbon. It venerates the Russian military and Russian military triumphs. In Moscow, they will hand out to visiting diplomats from other countries, they'll hand out those ribbons in the hope you won't know. You'll put it on because, oh, this is something jaunty. Then they'll take photos. It's a gotcha moment, right? The fact that that ribbon is there on that picture is proof positive that this is something that was directed by the Russian embassy. In the bottom right, I was getting angry about it and tweeting and saying this is idiotic and silly. This is Semyon Boykov, the self-styled Aussie Cossack who's currently in hiding in the consulate, Russian consulate in Sydney. He is hiding from the New South Wales police, who want to arrest him for assaulting a 74-year-old man at a rally last year. I think it was last year, it might have been this year. Also a known wife beater and all-round not very nice chap, who says that he is waging an information war against Australia and the West for Russia. He styles himself as the Ataman, the top Cossack in Australia, the leader. In fact, he's not. There's a bloke in his 70s also, a guy who's 77, I think, called Mikhail Ovchinnikov, who's in the construction business in Sydney, who also does martial arts clubs, who is the one who has taken over from him. And they publish a magazine called Horizon. They republish a Russian paper called Argumenty I Fakti, Arguments and Facts. And they publish other things, newsletters that focus on everything from UFOs to sex to conspiracy theories. And there have been a lot of links between Ovchinnikov, but also Boykov and the sovereign citizen cooker type movement, the Citizens Electoral Council, the Australian far right, effectively. And most recently, this was off the Facebook page of Perth Rally for Freedom version 2, this last weekend. Free Assange, end the war in Ukraine, stop AUKUS, cost of living crisis, stop various bills, accountability for vaccine injuries and deaths, no to 15/20-minute cities, smart cities and solutions. So it's a cornucopia of complaint, effectively. Those who are into any conspiracy theory, plus, of course, what the Russian embassy wants you to hear, which is no to AUKUS, because the United States is the world's most dangerous power, and no to war in Ukraine. On the right, there's the Night Wolves, and of course, some real nutters with Israel did the Bali bombings with nuclear bombs. No, they didn't. A variety of useful idiots in the Australian ecosystem. Kate Johnston has an enormous number of followers and will spout Russian propaganda till the cows come home. So too, unfortunately, will Tony Kevin. He is the former ambassador, Australian ambassador to Cambodia, former Australian ambassador to Poland, and he publishes frequently on the blog Pearls and Irritations, which has become basically a far, far right Trumpist site, particularly on the question of the war in Ukraine. Michael Tracy has a large number of followers. The thing that makes me saddest of all is that a voice from my childhood is part of this. Mary Kostakidis, the former SBS newsreader, who has gone well down the rabbit hole, who is tweeting about Thierry Meyssan. The goal of the Ukraine conflict is to economically collapse Europe in order for it to be dominated by the United States. I have had a few interactions online with Mary. She's just gone completely bonkers, I'm afraid. So, to finish off, why is this interesting? A lot of people say Russia is far away. You know, it's not an issue for us. Well, in an era where we talk about information warfare, distance is no real boundary anymore. Even if it were, Sydney is in fact closer to Vladivostok than it is to New Delhi. Sydney is also almost the exact same distance from Honolulu to Vladivostok, something that we don't realise. Russia does pose a threat to our interests, to our values, and of course, those of our key partners. Russia has by necessity pivoted to Asia because Putin is done in the West. Australia and Russia deal in the same stuff. We are natural economic competitors. We sell gas, we sell coal, we sell iron ore, we sell wool, we sell grain. So do the Russians. They are going to come and try and muscle in on our markets. This is something that's problematic for us because Russian interest in Australia is growing. It's growing partly because it needs to focus on the region, but also because we're an oddity, that we have supported very robustly the rules-based order within the region, but also support for Ukraine. And we are on the list of, we've been on the list of so-called unfriendly nations that the Russians have for a while. We were kind of down the bottom, about number 12. Now we're about number 6, so we're not top tier, but we're top of the second tier. The Russians have a word for countries they really don't like, vragi. It means enemies. It's a kind of visceral word that says, you know, I hate you and everything you stand for. You are my enemy. It's really silly to assume that we're immune from Russian active measures. We know that they're very active in cyber. We know also that they're potentially active in terms of manipulation of populations. Whether it's useful idiots to assets, of course, we kicked out a whole bunch of Russian diplomats recently. They weren't diplomats. People often ask me in the ADF and up at Russell and at Foreign Affairs, who is the biggest target of Russian intelligence activities? It's you guys. Right? Previously it was academics. Now it's anyone with a security clearance. That's both for disinformation and for recruitment as well. We know that they're very active in the grey zone space, in offensive cyber and in hybrid. We know also that the Russians are not averse to doing things even up to sabotage to serve their interests, because they simply do not care. The picture, by the way, is the Gorgon gas terminal in WA. I ran a scenario exercise with some folks out at ADC about 6 months ago around the question, what happens if a couple of Russian guys in the fitness industry decide to visit the gleaming spires of Karatha and put a bomb there. If they put a bomb there, that would take off Australia's ability to export natural gas, about 40% of it, for around about 2 years. So we are vulnerable in that respect too. Folks, thank you very much. You've been extremely patient with me. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. And before we get into the questions, I just to offer for those of you who are watching online, please do send through your questions and please do in your messages introduce yourself and if you can, say where you're coming from. And before we get into the questions in the room here, I'd just like to particularly offer my appreciation for adding in some colourful language. I think I'll stick with the fire hose of falsehoods because I would hate to touch that firearm that you mentioned and clean it. And I'd also offer that, you know, it was great to see some of the Russian Orbat put out there, particularly the Chief Gargoyle. And, you know, student of merit definitely to you for pointing us towards that. My favourite term of the lecture is Prigozhin's period of being unmurdered. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
So with that, if we do have any questions from in the room here, I believe we've got one lined up. If you can, just introduce yourself first and then pose your question, please.
Captain Dmitry Kannikov, Headquarters 2nd Australian Division. Well, thank you very much, Matt, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm going to speak from my experience, I guess. I was born in Russia. I lived in Australia for 15 years, and I call this country home. And there's something you mentioned in your presentation about Ruski Mir, and my question will be around that. Yeah. Based on some anecdotal evidence that I have, but I think it's representative, a lot of Russian-born Australians left Russia for the reasons that would probably predetermine our opposition to any idea of Ruski Mir, at least under the current Russian government. Many of us work for the government and have skills and knowledge that may as well be very helpful in identifying the context and the extent of the Russian influence in Australia. So my question is, how does the Australian government effectively protect its national interest against the Russian influence without disenfranchising the Russian-speaking Australians broader in the community and those that work for the government?
That is an outstanding question. It's one that we face also in respect to other countries that cannot be named, given that there are 1 million people from that country who live in Australia. One of the things that we need to do is show that we are dissatisfied with the actions of a regime, not the people that that country call or once called that country home, or have cultural, linguistic, ethnic ties to that country. I can recommend very much, you're probably familiar with Subverted Alliance, that is active in Melbourne and in Sydney and in Perth. Russians who actively point out areas where other people of Russian descent in Australia are acting poorly. The Sydney Morning Herald recently, Matthew Knott, the journalist, published the piece on Simeon Boykov based on information that came from Subverted Alliance about the extent to which Boykov was involved in reaching out to the different right-wing communities and sovereign citizen communities and organising rallies. And this was coming out of the Russian consulate and the Russian embassy. So I think they perform a fabulous service. I think it's also wrong that the Australian government and Australian tertiary institutions have drawn a blanket line under Russian students, no Russian students. That's not the way to win friends and influence people. So I think what we fundamentally need to do is say, it is the regime we have the argument with, not the people. That would be my answer.
Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, we've got another one in here.
Hi Matt, Captain Robinson from 9Reg. Noting that the world's focus at the moment is essentially focused on Russia and Ukraine and the conflict, have you seen any data to indicate an uptick on other nations increasing their disinformation and misinformation campaigns to enhance their own political agenda, noting that the whole world is focused on one region?
Yes. Absolutely. There has been a lot of messaging from states that are being opportunistic. Some of them we would call partners, in fact. And some countries taking the opportunity to carry out acts that are decidedly, not friendly, not democratic. So it's not something that starts and stops with, an axis of the odd or an axis of the authoritarians necessarily. It is a worrying time, I think, in the information ecosystem generally, because there is a lot of attempt to sway opinion. And of course, we know that when people respond emotionally to messaging, that is likely to capture their attention more than something that is based on fact and analysis, because we've tried that. We tried debunking conspiracy theories, and if you believe it, you just believe it. It's an article of faith. Or if you're susceptible to it, you are not going to change these people's minds. I worry about, and I completely Catholic on, whichever side anyone comes down on, I worry about the outcome of the voice referendum, particularly if it does go no a lot, that this will be used by Russia, by other states, to say that Australia is imperialistic, racist, hegemonic, doesn't belong. Now, that might not change the game, but it will certainly play to some very well-held stereotypes within our region and possibly make life more difficult for us.
Fantastic question, thanks. I've got another one in here.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Sarah Jane Harding from 17 Brigade. Listening to your lesson today, I felt like I was back in the 1980s when I was a Cold Warrior way back when. So, and one thing that's disturbing I see is the rise of the strongman form of government. There have been a number of coups through sub-Saharan Africa, and there's the potential for Trump getting back in the States if he doesn't get bumped off the ballot somehow, and him pandering to Putin. And, that's, that fifth column within, our closest ally.
Yeah. Look, I couldn't agree with you more. The American one is, this is the one that we cannot speak of at all. with the nightmare scenario, Trump 2.0. We didn't plan for Trump 1.0. Trump 2.0, we're just pretending is not going to happen. Because if it does, goodbye Ukraine. Goodbye European security, frankly, because he'll take a transactional approach to NATO. Goodbye AUKUS. Right? Probably goodbye anything close to a security guarantee, unless it comes with an extraordinarily high price. I see this as a really pivotal moment for democracies. I'm very worried about it. You're absolutely right to say also that populist coups and things that brand themselves as populist, regardless of whether they are or not, are real worries. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is Wagner and Russia that is pushing this. It's effectively minimising US influence, particularly the recent coup in Niger, because the Americans had special forces base and a drone base there, had really good relations with the government. That's gone. French influence is eroding. Right? So, sorry?
This morning was reported that the French are
Yeah, yeah. So this is a real worry. That, I mean, unfortunately, we can't be everywhere at once, and we're going to have to make choices. But of course, when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, gold mines, diamond mines, iron ore, there's something that we're worried about because the Chinese are investing there too. What happens if it comes to a point where they say, well, we don't need your iron ore, we'll just get it from the Brazilians and we'll just get it from Africa. You know, you find another buyer, which we will, but probably not at the same price and not at the same volume. So those are concerns beyond the political spectrum and the sort of rules-based order normative spectrum that actually have economic implications, you know, the future prosperity of Australians that we need to be really worried about. Couldn't agree with you more.
Thanks for bringing us down on that one.
Sorry.
A little bit. So I'll stop with the questions in the room for now. I'll come back to you. So we've had one waiting online here. So Major James Elling from Drocham. Yep. His question is when thinking about these disinformation campaigns, is it worthwhile thinking in terms of moral centres of gravity, or is there a better framework that we can use or aim for?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because you would think that a moral centre of gravity is something that you can reach for to appeal to the better angels of people's nature. One of the disturbing things about the contemporary, technologically advanced, sophisticated information environment, I think, has been an erosion of a sense of, how shall I put this? Sense of consequence, right? A sense of consequences for actions. I think there is a very concerning, easy reaction by people, almost viscerally, to say, "Oh well, it doesn't matter. The Russian government tells me the Ukrainians are all Nazis. We'll just wipe them all out." That's outrageous. That's disgusting. So, appeals to morality, unfortunately, can be effective, but they can be just as effective when they're wielded by countries that are seeking to promote bad narratives. And when you're looking at propaganda, particularly, and propaganda we know has been around forever, it's not a new thing, right? Propaganda almost always has a grain of truth, but it's just a grain. And then around the grain, a lie is wrapped, and a bigger lie, and a bigger lie, and a bigger one. Right? So ultimately, you end up believing that the goal of the United States is to ensure that all countries in the world are at war with one another or subservient to it, because in every war that's happened, the US has emerged the victor. So it requires war to continue. Or the view that the globalists are in charge of the world, rootless cosmopolites, it's all the Jews' fault. Right? These are narratives that will circulate and circulate. So when it comes to morality arguments, I think, yes, absolutely they should be used, right? But they should be used recognising also that notions of morality, and I'm not saying that they're particularly moral, notions of morality, notions of doing the right thing are also used by our adversaries, and combating that is very difficult.
Nice, thanks. Major Elling, I hope that answers your question. Thank you. We've got a question here, sir.
Hi, Doctor. Lieutenant Colonel Phil Clegg from HQ 17 Brigade. Even regimes like Putin's rely on some degree of support from the base population.
Yep.
What does the Moscow taxi driver make of the present circumstance?
Yeah. The Moscow taxi driver probably wants to see a negotiated outcome for the war, but nonetheless supports it. And also blames the West. says it's the West's fault. There is genuine support for Putin. There is genuine support for his war. He's had effectively a generation to indoctrinate Russians. He's been in power, longest serving leader since Stalin. Excuse me. And yeah, that message really catches hold, even though in a kind of unenthusiastic way. There is a Russian far right, which is quite active, which says that Putin has not prosecuted the war vigorously enough, that he should use tactical nuclear weapons, that he should use chemical weapons, that this is all because Putin is being too nice. Recalling that in Russia, Putin, he's not, but he sells himself as a moderate, right? Someone in the middle of the political maelstrom, or in fact above it. Everybody else fights and argues, and then Putin comes in and takes the decision. Right? So yes, there is a degree in which popular legitimacy is important for Putin, but there's also a lot of levers he can pull to ensure that the population remains either more or less on his side or apathetic, right? And both are the same functionally in terms of regime survival. So I don't see a future where the Russian population rise up against Putin. However, I do think we have seen the end of the beginning of the end, get it right, of Vladimir Putin. If change does come, it'll come from the elites. Previously, the elites have had no incentive to not back Putin, partly because he made them sign a blood pact on Ukraine, but also partly because there's no alternative. There's no golden parachute. And there's the prospect of execution, poisoning, plane crash, if you do something. But eventually, people get sick of being purged for the leader's mistakes, and they say, we're not going to take this anymore. The problem is in Russia, for a group powerful enough to do that, it would have to be the ones with the guns, the ones with the information, and the ones with the jails, right? So joining forces effectively. And I think that will take some time. I think it'll happen, but I think it'll take some time.
Great question, thank you. We've got another one in the room here.
G'day, Matt. Nick Alexandra from HQ2Div. In the same vein, Russian military weakness, insecurity, logistic and moral fragility, it's all good for us and good for Ukraine on the one hand, but a lack of off-ramps decreases their predictability and prolongs the destruction. So based on what you just said, in the meantime, are there other feasible off-ramps that we're looking to cultivate strategically?
Off-ramps are offered to Vladimir Putin all the time. Interestingly, he has chosen not to avail himself of any of them and deliberately eschewed off-ramps. Unfortunately, this is a grim, conclusion, but my grim conclusion on this is that Putin has no incentive to do anything other than fight, because he cannot take home to the population the message, I have won a great ripping victory and I control 10% of Ukraine. It's basically what he started with, right, in 2022. The Ukrainians, in about 8 weeks, have pushed back about a third of what the Russians took extra in terms of the territory they gained after February 2022. February 2022. So the incentive for Putin is to keep fighting. His incentive, I think, is also for the West to give up, or his assumption is the West will give up supporting Ukraine. We talk about artillery ammo stocks for the Russians. Well, it's just as bad for us, right? If not worse in some cases, because you can fast-track starter chemicals to make RDX and high explosive, and you can order factories to start producing shells, all those types of things. In the West, it takes commercial agreements, it takes longer. So Putin's view is that he can wait the West out, and then he can force the Ukrainians to the bargaining table and say, well, we still keep Crimea, we still keep the Donbass. So I think that, when it all shakes out, we're going to end up with a very messy peace, whatever off-ramp is provided, when someone finally takes one. And of course, Zelensky has no incentive to do anything but continue fighting, right? Because if he says, okay, we'll sue for peace, then he'll be out of a job in 10 minutes, less. Right? Ukrainians have experienced what Russian occupation is. So the fighting continues, and then the piece we're left with is a nasty, messy, frozen conflict. I don't think the Ukrainians will get Crimea back. Don't quote me on that, please. I'd love them to. I don't think they will. I don't think they'll get all of the Donbass, simply through just running out of time and running out of material and capability. So unfortunately, it leaves a situation where the Russians can try again in a few years if we're not vigilant. And that means that a post-conflict Ukraine needs to be armed to the teeth, and it needs to have security guarantees.
So on that note, noting the time, we've been going for about an hour now, we'll close off the questions there and invite more discussion afterwards once the cameras are off, and hopefully we can get to some more of that colourful language that you've graced us with today, and hopefully some less depressing insights about Ukraine's future and the lessons we need to learn out of this. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you online, thank you so much for your attendance and for your participation. These have been some great discussions we've been having, and they're only getting better. The next session we've got for the last Tuesday of the month, CoveTalk series, is going to be with Major General Tomei on some of his reflections of the 2nd Australian Division. And we will continue these talks through to next year, and hopefully there'll be a few more sessions on the Cove. So with that, ladies and gentlemen in the room here, I ask you to show your appreciation in the usual way. Matt, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks a lot.